Hey everybody, Travis Bowman here. I'm a fingerstyle guitar player and retro video game nerd. So a while back, I made a video on my YouTube channel talking about how the Nintendo Switch 2 isn't for me. And I've gotten a lot of hatred out of that video since then. And to be honest, I kind of expected it. But instead of, revel in the hate and the negativity, I figured I'd try to turn that same concept of why that Nintendo Switch 2 just isn't for someone like me and turn it into a positive. And that's exactly what we're going to do today in this video. Let's say that you're a big fan of Nintendo, but like me and many others actually, you're taking a look at the Nintendo Switch 2 and you're thinking, you know what, this just isn't the same bang for my buck that other Nintendo consoles used to be. And that's a completely understandable thing. Gaming is going in a wildly different direction than it used to back in the day. With the introduction of game key cards and just digital games in general, not only that, but we also have a situation where if you want to chat with your other Nintendo Switch 2 compadres, you have to pay for that function. That's just a drop in the barrel. I won't go too far into complaining about the Nintendo Switch 2, considering that I don't have it, and I'm not planning on getting it. Maybe you really enjoy Nintendo for its games and its consoles that it's given us over the years, and flat out just enjoy Nintendo's history, but the Nintendo Switch 2, maybe not so much because of all the negative things that are coming along with that console. Yes, we finally have a Nintendo console that can do 4K and all that good stuff, but think about all the negatives too. We've got the game keycard situation, not actually owning your physical games, having to pay a subscription fee just to enjoy a few Gamecube titles and N64 titles, and not being able to chat with your friends unless you actually have that Nintendo Switch online service. There's a ton of negatives that we can get into that's even further than that, but honestly, I would rather stop here. We've gotten a ton of improvements for some Nintendo consoles over the years, and quite frankly, it can be a little bit overwhelming, which is to be expected. So my idea with this video is to try to condense all that down and show you what's been happening in the last 20 years. And these consoles pretty much went irrelevant. A lot of stuff has happened since then, and you might find yourself wanting to spend some of that Nintendo Switch 2 money on some of this cool stuff instead, and I wouldn't blame you because you probably get a little bit more bang for your buck. So without further ado, let's jump into it. First thing on the list is your Nintendo 64. Yes, you have that online service with your Nintendo Switch and your Nintendo Switch 2. However, you're missing a lot of games, and that's the biggest negative with that. You can only play what Nintendo allows you to play on their system, which kind of sucks, man, especially because the entire Nintendo 64 library could fit on one of those game cards for your Nintendo Switch. But they can't put everything on there, of course, but what you can do is get a device like this, the Everdrive for your Nintendo 64. This is the Everdrive 64X7. This contains every single N64 game from every single region. And on top of that, you've got a couple enhancements that go with this as well. You've got a battery in here that acts as a real-time clock. And admittedly, that only works for the Animal Crossing game, which I believe is called Animal Forest. You can also have a lot of enhancements on here, as well as ROM hacks, which is a really cool thing. We only think about that stuff when we're talking emulation. You can actually take a modified game, a modified ROM, put it on this cartridge, slap it in your N64, and play it just like you could any other game, any real game. Everdrives are super underrated, and I say that knowing that a lot of people know about them still, but they are some of the coolest tools for guys like me that are really into game preservation. In addition to that, we've got some third-party companies such as Retro Fighters that have given us some really cool wireless controllers for these old systems, and I think that the one for the N64 is likely one of the best ones ever. Everybody likes to dog on the N64 controller. It's not my favorite, it never has been, but I tolerated it, and it's actually really great for the games that support it. My problem with it now is that my hands are just freakishly big, and it really rubs my knuckle raw, and it's just not a good experience, and I really don't want to continue doing that. However, this new wireless controller from Retro Fighters is so great, man. I mean, it plays Mario 64 just like the N64 controller does, in my opinion. I mean, yeah, you're going to have a little bit of some differences here and there, but for the most part, they're awesome. And that's why I have 4 of them hooked up to my N64 at all times, because you know what? I have my buddies over here every once in a while, and we like to jump into some Mario Tennis because it's one of the greatest multiplayer games ever. It is so much fun. And having 4 wireless controllers really eliminates that nasty, here's wires going all over the place and they get crisscrossed and tied up and jumbled up and stuff like that. Not to mention the cats. If you got animals, they love to chew on those sorts of things if they can get their hands on it without you looking. This eliminates that altogether. Now, I wouldn't be fair if I was going to praise everything about the Everdrive and these wireless controllers without telling you some negatives about the N64 in today's day and age, and that is displaying it. Yeah, so the N64 natively only does S-video and composite, and I guess RF too if you want to include that, but those video outputs are not very good, unfortunately. Now, you can do an RGB modification on this N64, which I've done to mine. And if you want to go a step further, there is an HDMI mod that looks absolutely fantastic, but those are getting kind of pricey. So if you're going to get into the N64, I highly recommend it, but you should get on the Facebook Marketplace or just search around, ask your buddy, a friend of a friend, if they have an old CRT. Now, I know a lot of people don't really get into that because it takes up a lot of space, but does it really, though? Does it really take up that much space? Find one corner in your house and get you a 30-inch CRT television, and you will have a blast playing the N64, especially if it's an S-video. That's such a wonderful upgrading quality from composite and especially RF. But I'll be the first to admit that I have the RetroTink 4K, which is a really expensive, fancy upscaler. I use it for YouTube stuff like the footage that you're seeing right now. However, you could probably tell that even after I've spent all that money on that upscaler and I got this RGB modification on this N64, it still kind of looks bad. You know, the N64 is just not a very good looking console, unfortunately, and we can definitely see that here on this footage. But, you know, if you can get past the ugly visuals, or maybe you want to do that HDMI mod, it's definitely worth it because the N64 has a pretty good library of some really great games. And two of those are some of my favorites of all time, Mario Tennis and, of course, Hybrid Heaven. All right, so there's your N64. Let's talk Super Nintendo, man. You know, I didn't grow up with the Super Nintendo, but I'm really, really happy to have one today. It was one of the last consoles that I got from my collection because I was a Sega kid. I was a Sega Genesis guy, and then I played the Sega Dreamcast, and that was my favorite console of all time, and it still is. However, I have to admit that the Super Nintendo library is such a vast library full of all sorts of great games of all different genres, and you would be silly to not have one of those if you're into Nintendo at all. And yes, you can get on the Nintendo Online service and play a few of these Super Nintendo games, but you're missing out on some really, really great titles that, quite frankly, probably will never show up on that subscription service. Now, why would you pay all that money every month when you could just drop a pretty decent chunk of change and get you this FX Pack Pro? So this is the Rolls Royce of flash cartridges, or at least one of them. You know, there's several flash cartridges. If you're going to get one, you definitely want to get this one, which is in collaboration with Crix and Akari 01. This is a wonderful, wonderful flash cartridge. You've got a micro SD card on top there. You can load it up with all your favorite ROMs, and voila, you've got every single Super Nintendo game on your system. Now, the wonderful thing about this particular cartridge is that you don't have to worry about those special chip games. What I mean is that certain games took advantage of some extra chips that were in those games, and you kind of needed that to communicate with your system to get those cool Mode 7 graphics, as well as some other effects and stuff like that. But this cartridge has everything that you could possibly need. What I love about the Everdrive is that after it's been sold and moved on and we're on to other things, we're doing other Everdrives, you know, Crix is the man, dude. He constantly updates all of his cartridges. If there's one or two games that aren't supported, he will continue working on that cartridge to make sure that he can give you a firmware update that will allow you to play that stuff. So I really like buying the Everdrives directly from Crix because he's from Ukraine. He's a really cool guy, and I really like supporting him because he's probably the most influential person in the past 10 or 15 years as far as retro video game preservation, man. I mean, we have access to all these games and being able to test them out. You know, people can create their own games for the Super Nintendo and use the Everdrive as like a test cartridge. I'm gonna put my game on this SD card and put it in the cartridge to make sure everything runs fine. You know, the list goes on and on and on. So what about this cartridge in particular, this specific cartridge right here? The number one extra feature that you can get on this Super Nintendo cartridge, in my opinion, is the addition of having your Game Boy games. So back in the day, you actually needed this Super Game Boy right here if you wanted to play your Game Boy games on your Super Nintendo. You don't need this anymore because you can add those Game Boy ROMs onto this device right here. You have no need for this, and voila, you've got two systems in one thanks to this cartridge. you can play your Super Nintendo games, and you can also play your Game Boy games on this cartridge, which is a really freaking cool addition, man. And last but not least, we have to talk about the MSU1 enhancements. So what is that? Long story short, you've got some games that can take advantage of a newer CD quality audio, which is amazing, man. I did a video all about this cartridge. If you want to check that out on my channel, I'll put a link in the description. But it's pretty amazing to actually hear some iconic soundtracks like from Chrono Trigger and Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, and then hear them with that CD quality audio enhancements. What's really crazy about it is that they don't just take away the game audio and then replace it with the CD stuff. It is integrated, baked into the game. So yes, this is a very pricey cartridge, but think about that Nintendo Switch Online service and you spending all that money every single month. That will add up over the console's lifespan. If you're into the Super Nintendo, then this cartridge is a must buy for sure. Speaking of Everdrives, unfortunately, you know, even the Super Game Boy, you can't really play too many Game Boy Color games, and you definitely can't play Game Boy Advance games. So that brings me to my next console, which is hidden back here. A modified Game Boy Advance with a custom shell, new screen, and a rechargeable battery mod. This thing is so awesome. Now, I remember getting my Game Boy Advance when I was a little kid. You know, I opened it up on the floors for my birthday or something like that, and I was in love with the thing, man. Despite not ever playing the Super Nintendo, you know, the Game Boy Advance can be thought of as a, you know, miniature Super Nintendo. They were kind of on par, maybe a little bit better graphically as far as the Super Nintendo is concerned, or the Game Boy Advance rather. Having a Game Boy Advance with a new screen is really amazing, man. And I know you probably can't see it too well from that far away, but I'll try to get you some B-roll footage of how great this screen looks. It is amazing. It's a true backlit screen. It's an LCD. It's a big upgrade from what we used to have with this cartridge back in the day. But that's not exactly what I want to talk about. You can get one of these on eBay or build one yourself, which is really cool. But you guessed it, we've got an Everdrive GBA Mini cartridge inside of that system. So not only do you have every Game Boy Advance game that you could possibly want on here, but you also can emulate your Game Boy and Game Boy Color games as well. This cartridge is actually not that expensive. You're talking like maybe $100. Which, you know, $100 is $100, but if you've got 3 handheld consoles worth of games on one cartridge that you can take anywhere that you want around the go in your Game Boy Advance, that's a lot of bang for your buck, my friend. So do you see what I'm getting at? We're starting to put things into perspective. It's nice that we've got 4K Nintendo games for the first time and everything, but as far as bang for your buck, we're starting to see there's a lot of value in these Everdrives and these old consoles, especially with their enhancements. Now, speaking of enhancements, before we move on, the Super Nintendo. We got to talk negatives about that. Unfortunately, you do not get a native RGB signal out of this. You have to modify it. However, if you are a habitual tinkerer like I am, and if you're a novice at soldering, if you have yourself a Super Nintendo Junior, recapping this thing and doing that RGB mod is actually a pretty easy thing to do, and it's a good first mod. As long as you take your time and be very patient, not try to rush it. I did a RGB mod on this thing all by myself, and I suck at soldering, you know, and I replaced the capacitors as well. It was actually a really, really easy thing to do because there's not a lot of parts in there. It's actually a really good project for a novice, and I highly recommend it. Now, the Super Nintendo Juniors are highly coveted because their RGB signal is a lot cleaner, a lot crisper. Pixels look a hell of a lot better compared to some of the other Super Nintendo consoles that aren't one-chip consoles. But that's a whole other thing. You can do your own research on that. That's probably the only negative I can think about this Super Nintendo right here, is that if you want the best picture out of it, you're going to have to RGB modify it. The same thing can be said about the Game Boy Advance. I would never attempt to put in the new screen in this guy because we're talking teeny tiny little baby parts in here, and I got big giant monkey hands, and the two do not mesh very well at all. I've put a new screen in an original Game Boy before, and it's awesome, but this one I'm not so sure about. Now let's jump to our friend the Nintendo GameCube right here. This is such an underrated console that a lot of people are really starting to go back and really enjoy for a couple of different reasons, but I think the main one is the addition of ODE stuff regarding the Nintendo GameCube. So ODE stands for Optical Drive Emulator. You can take out that old disk drive that admittedly is going to fail at some point because that's just the nature of disk drives. They're not built to last forever. And you can replace those with an SD card reading device that will allow you to put all your games on that SD card. You don't have to worry about that disk drive failing and not being able to play your games anymore. Of course, with most ODEs, if you end up doing that, then you lose the ability to play your legitimate games. But I've got that same situation in this console right here, but my disk drive is still in there. It's still working just fine. So what I'm referring to is the Pico Boot mod. Underneath this, we have a tiny little PCB, and you insert your SD card in there. It's a super cheap part too, man. And it's very easy to set up as long as you follow a guide. But more importantly than that, you can still use your Game Boy player attachment underneath this guy. In my opinion, this is the only way to continue playing Game Boy games, because I just don't really find this as fascinating as I do playing Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games on the big TV. It's freaking awesome, dude. This is by far the best way to play Game Boy games of any generation, in my opinion, with that Game Boy player. So yeah, negatives about this, that's your video output. That seems to be a theme here in this episode, is that either the video output is just too expensive, or it's just too much of a hassle to worry about having to mod your console and stuff like that. But unfortunately, if you want to get a good picture out of your Nintendo GameCube, you're going to have to pay for that. The best possible quality you could get is the official Nintendo component cables, which admittedly are extremely rare and expensive. Nobody wants to spend over $200 for some video cables. However, you can get a couple of different devices, either the Carby or you can do the Eon, which are two devices that are meant for the Nintendo GameCube. Their only purpose is to send out a higher quality signal via either component or HDMI. I like the Eon myself because it allows me to go out with a component cable signal instead of an HDMI. I feel like I have better control over that, and plus I can still display that on my CRT televisions, which is really, really nice. But there are a ton of third-party controllers for this console, some of which are really comparable to the official Nintendo Wavebird controller, which in my opinion is one of the best controllers ever made. But there are some great ones out there, and I would encourage you to check the link in the description if you're interested in those third-party Nintendo GameCube controllers. There's a lot of them out there, and I really think you should give them a look if you're interested in continuing with your Nintendo GameCube. So yes, we have emulation on your Nintendo Switch 2 with the Nintendo GameCube, but I mean, come on, dude, look at this. It's the GameCube. It's so small, it's so cool, it's so purple, and you've got your handle right there too. You know, it's just not the same thing. I don't know if it's just me. I mean, surely not. Most people seem to be completely fine with this, with taking games that they used to love and just emulating them on another console. But that always bothered me when the real thing still exists, you know? This is the way I like to look at this sort of stuff, man. Like, I am gonna be 40 in 7 years, you know? It's not that far away at all. And, you know, if you look at the grand scheme of things, we're all gonna die. And I still really love this stuff. It's so cool to have the physical console right here in front of me. I can press this reset button. I can press this open button to open that disk drive. I have to physically press the power button. It's just not the same to me to have that sort of emulation, even if it is on an official Nintendo console. If the GameCube is still out there and it's still within a decent price range, and of course if you just want the console, it definitely is. It's just when you get into the modifications and the different video cables, depending on your setup, that's where things get a little expensive. But it's so nice to be able to have all the GameCube games that I could want on this SD card and be able to play them on a real Nintendo GameCube. It's a really, really cool thing, you know what I mean? All that stuff is great, but what if you want something more? Why not visit a console that is not a Nintendo console that you've never messed with before? I don't know about you guys, but I've found so many great games that I otherwise never would have played just by jumping into a new console, you know? So on the table, I've got the Sega Saturn, one of history's most underrated video game consoles ever. You know, at the time that this was released, the PS1 was coming out, the N64 was coming out, you know, so you had some competition there, two big heavy hitters. The PlayStation 1 killed it, man, and nobody expected it to at that time, but it sure did. N64, Nintendo is always gonna, you know, be somewhat successful. A lot of people would say that the N64 was a flop. Others would argue against that, but what I'm getting at is that this is a vastly misunderstood console, and it's easier to get into now than it ever was. RGB video out comes native on this console. You don't have to do any modifications, just get you an RGB SCART cable and find a way to connect that to your display, and you'll be good to go. In addition to that, you can have an ODE for this, just like I have in here. This is called the Finrear. It's the exact same thing that I was talking about earlier. You replace that disk drive, which is going to fail at some point if it hasn't already. and replace it with an SD card reader. But these days you don't even have to do that, man. You can get on AliExpress. Yes, I know, AliExpress, bear with me. If you get on that website, you can find a cartridge which is called a Saroo, S-A-R-O-O. This is a newer development in Sega Saturn technology. So this cartridge right here, this is a backup cartridge that I use for saves and stuff like that, but it also acts as a RAM cartridge. Some games on this system needed extra RAM so the games could run properly, but you can replace this with that Saroo device and all of your games will go on an SD card inside of that, which is freaking amazing considering that, you know, for the longest time, the Sega Saturn was one of the most difficult consoles to emulate, and to get the real deal experience, you needed a Sega Saturn console. You can still find Japanese Sega Saturn consoles for pretty cheap, depending on where you look. Make sure you know what the going rate is and everything. Don't overpay for one of those things. But, you know, that Saroo cartridge, it's like 40 or 50 bucks, dude. And then you get an SD card, put all your games on there, and then you've got a wonderful brand new console. The entire library is yours to thumb through and find games that you've never heard of before that you legitimately will love. And it's impossible for you to jump into the Sega Saturn and not find a game that you at least kind of like, because over in Japan, they had like something around, you know, 1,800 games or something like that. We only had a few of them over here in the States compared to that, but there are so many games on that system. I need to do a dedicated video on the Sega Saturn for sure, because it is one of my favorite consoles ever, super underrated system, and you might find some unexpected joy in jumping into a console that you've likely never heard of or even thought of getting into before. And now we're getting to the end of this video, so we have to talk about the ethical part of this. Is this even an ethical thing to do? It's not illegal to have all this stuff, otherwise it wouldn't be sold and I wouldn't be talking about it right now. What I am doing is not promoting piracy or anything like that. What I'm doing is promoting game preservation. And that brings me to the last point about the Nintendo Switch 2. Let's take any game off of this shelf, for example. Let's go with Soulcalibur 4 on the Xbox 360. This is a wonderful example of the point that I'm about to make. What we have right here is a game on a disc, and it comes with a manual complete with instructions and some information about the controls, all that good stuff, and you've got information about the characters, all that good stuff that you would expect to be in a manual. This game is pretty cheap, $10 or less, as a matter of fact, and it's on two different consoles. You can get this on the PlayStation 3 as well as the Xbox 360, and it's a great game to this day. It's still one of the best Soulcalibur games ever, one of the best fighting games I've ever played, and it's got a really cool inclusion of some Star Wars characters, namely Yoda, Darth Vader, and a character that was really popular in the Star Wars The Force Unleashed games called Galen Merrick, Star Killer, The Apprentice, whatever you want to call him. I've played the crap out of this game, and I've played all the different characters, and it's so much fun. What I'm leading to is today, though. George Lucas sold Star Wars to Disney, and when that happened, you could no longer buy DLC for this game pertaining to those Star Wars characters. Back in the day, you had exclusivity between your two consoles. They weren't just the exact same game. This right here has Yoda as a playable character, and on the PlayStation 3, you had Darth Vader. So the two are different in that regard, but you can still pay to get that extra character. So for example, you can pay to get Darth Vader on this game. You don't have to go out and buy a PlayStation 3 to play as that character. But when Lucasfilm sold the rights to Star Wars to Disney, it's gone. You can't get it anymore, unless, of course, ironically, you pirate it. You can't get that DLC anymore. It's just gone. It's out of here. You can't have it anymore. Sorry, we're Disney. We paid for this, and we don't want you to have it anymore. You know, of course they're not thinking like that, but you get my point. Digital stuff is not the way of the future. I mean, it is the way of the future, but it's not the way of the future if you are a game preservationist like I am, and how you see video games like I do, which is just a damn shame. So I think about the Nintendo Switch 2, and I think about how they're going with these digital games and with these game key cards and all this other stuff that just doesn't really make sense, considering that most of their games should be able to fit on that cartridge. I know that some of them won't. Some of them are actually really big titles that won't be able to fit on there, but it's a little concerning. You know, there's a reason that I have all this stuff here still, because I have great nostalgia for it, and I just worry about what that's going to look like when little Timmy, who's 8 years old now, grows up to be 30 like me. Maybe he has kids of his own and he wants to share some of that nostalgia with his children. But all he's got is a plastic case. That's a damn shame, man, considering that there's so much that goes into these games. You know, you've got your manual, you've got some box art, and you've got the physical disc, you know, stuff like that that's really, really cool. And unfortunately, that seems to be going away. And I think we're in the last generation of video game consoles that will have physical media, which is just a damn shame. So if you want to go back in time and enjoy Nintendo instead of spending all of your hard-earned cash on a Nintendo Switch 2, these are some great options, and that's just a drop in the bucket, my friend. There's a lot of great consoles that have Everdrives and easier ways to enjoy the entire library of the game, because in my opinion, you should never, ever be stuck with only playing a couple of games out of that library. The Nintendo 64 is still here. The Super Nintendo is still here. The Sega Saturn has always been here. Nintendo GameCube is still here. You don't have to pay an online subscription service to enjoy this console. It's still here. It's really not that old, man. You know, it's been around for a while, but it's not ancient. It's still available to you. You can still get that wonderful experience of playing your Nintendo GameCube without having to pay an online subscription service. But it's up to you guys. So I'd really love to hear what you think about this in the comment section below. Do you have any of these old consoles? If you could have one old console to hook up to your HD television and play the entire library from, which console would that be? How do you feel about the Nintendo Switch 2 as well as the online subscription service that is needed to play Nintendo GameCube games, Super Nintendo games, and Nintendo 64 games? I would love to know the answers to all those questions in the comments section below. Be sure to check the description if you're interested in any of the Everdrives or controllers that I talked about today. I'll have links to every single one of those that you can check out in the description below. Thank you so much for watching this video. Thank you for subscribing, and I'll catch you guys at the next one. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.